If you want to just say next slide or something, and I'll go on to the next slide for you. Okay. So yeah, I'll just introduce you for a second. So yeah, it's my pleasure to announce via Skype. I've never done anything like this before, so it's a bit strange. This is one of the most influential and controversial philosophers alive today. This is Professor Peter Singer.
Thanks very much. It's good to be able to be with you. I'm sorry in a way I can't be with you in person, but on the other hand, it's great that I can be with you and talk to you, and I don't have to travel, I don't have to burn up more fossil fuels and add to climate change in order to do it. So the technology is not perfect, but it has many advantages. I also want to say I'm delighted that you're forming a group of Giving What We Can in Birmingham. You're part of a movement which is in an early stage still, I believe, but it's spreading around the world, certainly in a number of different countries, of people who are, I suppose, thinking about living a more ethical life and about what that involves, and that at least part of that is going to involve contributing to solving the big problems of the world, even if you may or may not be directly responsible for them, but the idea that we have an obligation to do something for the global poor is an important part of that. The other thing that I want to say by way of starting is that this slide presentation that you're seeing, I guess you've already got the first slide up, is about the life you can save. It's based on the ideas of a book that I wrote with that title. The Life You Can Save is also forming organisations or chapters, branches, whatever you might call it, at different colleges and universities. And very often when you get different organisations working in the same field, there's a certain amount of competition between them, if you like, a certain amount of hostility. People want to promote their own brand. But one thing that has really been encouraging in this area, I think, is that it doesn't exist at all between Giving What We Can and The Life You Can Save. And we're working together. In fact, we're working under a joint umbrella, something that's being set up at the moment called the Centre for Effective Altruism. And I think that's terrific, because we recognise that our messages are essentially the same. There may be small differences, tweaks, but we're trying to do the same kind of thing, and it doesn't really matter too much which organisation. So let's talk about this issue, and I'm going to start with an example that I used many years ago in the first article that I wrote on this topic, but people still seem to respond to it. It's been around, so let's begin. So let's have the next slide. I'm actually, the picture I'm seeing of you is frozen, but also you have the slide up with the child in the water here?
Yeah.
Good. So I ask you to imagine that you're walking through a park. Maybe you can think of a park in Birmingham that you know, which has an ornamental pond in it. And you know that this pond is quite shallow. Perhaps you've seen kids playing it in the summer. But now there's nobody, or at first you think there's nobody in the pond. The park is deserted. You're just taking a shortcut through it, perhaps on your way to a lecture. But you see that there is, after all, something in the pond, and when you look closer, you see that it's a small child who appears to have fallen in the pond. And although the pond is shallow, it's too deep for this small child to stand. The child is splashing around and seems to be in imminent danger of drowning. So what do you do? Your first reaction, presumably, would be to look around and say, well, who's looking after this child? Where are the parents or the babysitter? But as I said, there's nobody else in the park. You don't know how the child got into the pond. but there doesn't seem to be anyone there who's looking after the child at the moment, and the child could drown any second. So your next thought is, well, I better down jump into the pond and save the child. And you can do that. You have no doubt that you can save the child, but just before you jump in, the thought occurs to you, not a very noble one, that unfortunately you put on your favourite new pair of shoes that you just bought, quite an expensive pair, and you don't really have time to get rid of them. The child might drown. On the other hand, if you jump into the muddy water, they're probably going to get ruined. They're not the kind of shoes that would stand up to that. So now let's imagine that you have this further thought, this moment. Well, it's not, the child is not my responsibility. It's not my child. I wasn't looking after the child. I didn't push the child into the pond. So now, if it's a question of ruining my nice shoes or saving the child, maybe I'll just go on my way as if I'd never seen the child in the first place. I know the child will probably drown. There doesn't seem to be like anybody else is going to save this child, but it's none of my business. Well, the question I want to put, that I'm using this example to illustrate, is what would we think of somebody who thought like that and actually acted like that? Would we think that was okay, or would we think that that was actually quite horrible, that they had done something really seriously wrong? And when I put this to my students or other groups that I talk to, the reaction is, of course, that this would be wrong, that this would be a horrible thing to do. People say things like, you can't compare a child's life with the cost of a new pair of shoes. They say you'd have to be a monster to ignore a child in danger like that when the child will probably drown. And essentially they're saying, even if you are not responsible for the child being in the pond, the fact that you can save a child's life at a relatively small cost to yourself, some cost, but nothing comparable to the value of a child's life, means that that's what you ought to do. And obviously I think that this is right, that this is correct. But what I want to point out is that if we think about this in relation to our own situation as people living in a developed, affluent country, and people who, I'm assuming, let's say we are not at the very bottom of that, of the economic ladder in that country. We are not among the few who, unfortunately, even in developed countries, are struggling to get by. We're doing better than that. Then our situation is like that of the person who walks past the pond. Next slide. So that slide essentially just says what I just said, I guess. That we think about global poverty, we are actually walking past the pond, because I would bet for probably every one of you there in the audience, I don't know you, it's possible that I'm wrong, but I would bet for probably every one of you, there is something that you have spent money on that is just as unnecessary as, so more unnecessary even than this new and expensive pair of shoes. That is something that you spend money on that's really quite trivial. And the example I use, next slide, is to ask people, so have you spent anything at all on something to drink today or in the last couple of days when you had access to safe drinking water at no cost at all by getting it out of the tap? And of course most people today do buy things to drink when they don't really need them. It may be like in this slide, it may be bottled water. I don't know whether Britons are quite as bad as Americans on this, but Americans always seem to be picking up bottles of water, paying $1 or $1.50 or $2, depending where you are, for something that is essentially no different from what comes out of a tap. Maybe it's slightly better taste in some cases, depending where your tap water comes from, but it's really no significant difference. Or if it's not that, it's some other kind of soft drink or coffee or whatever it might be. Certainly most people do spend money on that. And that's obviously a very minor example of something that we're spending money on that we don't need to. There are many others that you can think of that people will have their own particular spending habits. So we are spending money on things that we don't need, and there's a lot more of that goes on in our study. If we have the next slide. This is on a social level. At the time that I wrote the book, I mentioned The Life You Can Save. The New York Metropolitan Museum of Art had recently bought this painting for $45 million. The painting is by Duccio, late medieval Italian painter. It's quite small. It's a very nice painting, but we need to ask what else we can do with this money, just as we can ask what else can we do with the money that over a year you might spend on things to drink that you don't really need. So we can ask what could we do with this? And so I did a costing of some of the things that various charities were spending money on, and for $45 million, well, there's an organisation performing cataract operations in developing countries, enabling people to see again. These are operations, of course, that you can get on the NHS at no charge, but there are billions of people in the world who don't have access to decent health care. And when people get a cataract, which is very common in elderly people, essentially they can go blind, but it's a simple and safe operation. So if it costs about $50 to restore someone's sight in a developing country, then for the cost of this painting, 900,000 people could have had an operation that would have enabled them to see, not just to see this particular painting, but to see anything at all. And seems to me if you value, if you think about the values involved, it wasn't a case that this painting was going to be destroyed if the Met didn't buy it. It was just a case that it was going to be hanging somewhere else. And I don't think that the value of the painting hanging in the Met, which already has a magnificent collection of paintings, is anywhere near the value of 900,000 people being able to see where they were blind or practically blind beforehand. So let's move to the next slide, which encapsulates the argument that I'm putting. So the moral premise, the first premise, is the one that is illustrated by the case of the child drowning in the pond. If we can prevent something bad without sacrificing anything nearly as important, we ought to do it. And the death of a child is something bad, and in the case of the child in the pond example, obviously we can prevent that without sacrificing anything nearly as important. Ruining a pair of shoes is not nearly as important as a child drowning, so the major premise is we ought to do it. The second premise is that extreme poverty is bad. We're now moving from the child in the pond to the global poverty situation. And let me just say a little bit about that. You may already know this, according to the World Bank standards, people are in extreme poverty if they cannot reliably provide for their basic needs or the basic needs of their dependents, of which, of course, food is a major basic need. So They may not be able to reliably all year round put enough food on the table for themselves and their dependents. But it may also be that they can't afford any health care. It may also be that they can't educate their children, that they don't have safe drinking water or decent sanitation. Those are all aspects of extreme poverty. And the World Bank estimates, puts the level of extreme poverty as roughly $1.25 per day. Now that actually needs to be adjusted a bit for inflation, but if you said $2 a day, something a bit over £1 a day perhaps, then that's the extreme poverty line. And this is the purchasing power equivalent of that amount of money. It's not, if some of you have travelled to developing countries, you might say, well, when I went to Malawi or where it was amazing. I changed my money into a local currency, and it was amazing what you could get for the equivalent of £1. I could get dinner and somewhere to sleep only cost me £2 or something like that. If you travelled in parts of the developing world and prepared to rough it a bit, you can live very cheaply. But what we're talking about is the purchasing power equivalent, not the currency conversion. So it's the amount in those countries that buys as much as you can buy for £1 or £1.50, whatever it might be in the UK. And if you think about trying to live on that amount in the UK, obviously you can see it is extremely tough. And there are over 1 billion people in the world living below that level. So I think the second premise is really hard to deny, that life like that, a constant struggle, one that in addition to the problem of meeting your basic needs is typically one that lacks what we would regard as essential dignity. People who are extremely poor are also generally powerless and subject to exploitation from other people. So I think it's really impossible to deny that that's bad. Now the third premise is a little bit more controversial. I'm going to say a little bit about that we can actually prevent at least some extreme poverty without sacrificing anything nearly as important. The sum is there, of course, because I'm not saying that we can prevent poverty. None of it, and even Bill Gates can't do that. Although perhaps collectively the affluent people in the world could do that. But I don't think we should focus on the size of the problem. I think that's an illusion that we're prone to. We say, look, I've just told me there's over 1 billion people living in extreme poverty. What can I do? Maybe I can help one or two, but there'll still be over 1 billion people living in extreme poverty. It's just drops in the ocean. But think of it in terms of the difference you can make to one family, just like the child in the pond case. You can make a difference to that child, and of course to that child's parents, wherever they are, even if they're being neglectful. So similarly, you can make a difference to one person or one family, and if you make a really big difference, really big improvement in the lives of one or two people, then that's all that the argument requires. You can do that without sacrificing anything nearly as important. Some of you may say, yeah, but does aid really work? I'm talking about giving to aid organisations. Does that really work? Well, the question is not really does aid in general work, but can we find effective organisations to donate to? So let's move to the next slide. So here's an organisation, this is a slide, this is just taken from the website of this organisation called GiveWell. You can find it yourselves later and have a look in depth. GiveWell.org is an organisation that does research in assessing charities, and it's extremely very small percentage of those reviewed that it actually recommends. But the important point is that it does recommend some that are highly effective, so that gives you some opportunities. And some people would say, well, I said that they're really too rigorous in their demands, and there may be others that you can find that are effective as well. I certainly think that's true. I think it's not the case that of the charities that they reviewed and didn't recommend, that they actually said these charities are ineffective. What they said was these charities have not produced the data and documentation that enables us to conclude that they are effective. And of course that's a different thing, because depending on what the charity does, it may be very hard for it to quantify the outcomes and show how effective they are. But it's enough that there are some that are effective, some that are highly cost effective. GiveWell, for example, finds organisations that can save a life for around $1,000 or so. If you think what you can do with that money, probably there's nothing that you can do with it that is in the UK that is going to be as significant, is going to save a life or have an equally great significance. So I think that premise, the third premise, is strong. Let's move to the next slide now. Here's an example of their highly rated charity, Against Malaria Foundation, is one of the ones that they're recommending. It installs insecticide-treated bed nets in parts of Africa or parts of the world that are prone to malaria. The bed nets themselves are very cheap. That's the $5 you see there on the slide. The cost of the net is only $5 to $6. But of course, not every net saves a child's life. It's not that all the children in these malaria-prone regions were dying. GiveWell estimates that it may cost something like $1,600 per life saved. But that doesn't include the other potential benefits of the prevention of malaria, because malaria can make people very ill, therefore can prevent them working effectively, or in the case of children, prevent them getting a decent education, because malaria just keeps coming back and makes them ill. And so the cost of saving a life doesn't include the other side benefits of preventing malaria and other mosquito-borne diseases that are not fatal. So that's just one example of what you can do with the money that you might save by not spending it on things that are really not necessary. Okay, now let's look at some objections if we move to the next slide. People will say a lot of different things when you put this argument. They'll say, well, doesn't my government already provide aid, foreign aid? Doesn't it do enough? So you're in the UK, your government does provide foreign aid. It provides actually significantly more foreign aid than the US government does on a per capita basis in relation to gross national product, not just sort of total. And to its credit, the UK government, in fact this is this was true under Labour as well as under the Tories now, the UK government is pledged to raise the amount of foreign aid it provides to the level that many years ago, back in the 1970s, the United Nations recommended, which is 0.7% of gross national product. When the UK reaches that level, it will join just half a dozen countries that are there at the moment. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, well maybe it's only 5 now, that are actually giving that amount. The US gives significantly less, and other countries give varying amounts. But still, when you think of it, that's not really all that much, right? That means for every £100 that earns as a country, it's giving 70 pence. So it's still a very small amount, and it's certainly still the case that you can give more, and by giving more you will save more lives. There's plenty of scope for more effective aid, despite the fact that governments do give at the moment. People also say, well, haven't you heard that? Haven't I heard that when you give people food, that just makes them dependent and even damages markets for food in developing countries? Yes, that's certainly true, but I'm not recommending giving food except in rare emergency situations where there really is a famine because of drought or war, which does occasionally happen. But it's, what I'm talking about is effective ways of helping people to become independent, to get out of the poverty trap, to sustain themselves, to educate their children. All of these things are important and don't breed dependency. And then the last of these objections that I get is people say, well, who are these people? I don't know them. Why am I responsible for them? And I think that that's just an unethical attitude to take. We don't only have ethical obligations to people we know, and that's what the example of the child in the pond was supposed to indicate. Okay, let's move on. We're getting near the end. So, what should we be doing? I know that Giving What We Can asks you to make a pledge of 10% of your income, and I think that that's a good level to aim at. But in fact, this slideshow that I prepared for The Life You Can Save is, I suppose, concerned to appeal to a wider audience and to draw in as many people as possible. So the giving starts at just 1% and then moves up depending on people's level of income. But the reason I mention this is, even if everybody did just give at that scale that I suggest in the book, The Life You Can Save, with many people only giving 1%, many people in the developed world only giving 1%, it would still raise far, far more than all of the foreign aid that we're giving now. And according to some estimates, for example, from the economist Jeffrey Sachs, would be enough to end large-scale extreme poverty throughout the world. Of course, there would always be pockets of poverty because of particular situations, wars or droughts, but we don't really have to continue to have more than 1 billion people living in extreme poverty. If we were to give at something like this rate, that would be enough to dramatically reduce extreme poverty throughout the world. So if we move to the next slide, this is the website of The Life You Can Save, which, like Giving What We Can, asks people to make a pledge. In fact, if you are going to pledge to Giving What We Can, which I certainly would encourage you to do, as I've done myself, you can also go to this website and take the pledge as well, because, as I say, unless you're really in the upper income brackets, then you the scale here is not going to require you to give more than 10%. It's going to require you to give rather less. Why not? Let's boost the numbers that we have here as well. Okay, so we've pretty much reached the end, I think. The next slide is the last slide. Just giving you the website, the web address for that website. But as I say, whether you're with Giving What We Can or The Life You Can Save doesn't matter at all to me. We're working for the same purposes. So that's what I have to say, and I think we have about 15 minutes for some discussion. So maybe if we take the slides off now, and I can see you already, but then you can see me too. And let's have about 15 minutes for any questions that you might like to ask.
Okay, let's just thank Professor Singer before we get into the questions. can take the first question then while we try and get the visual set up. Okay?
Well, if you don't get the vision, it's no big deal. You know,
Why don't you come to the front, then you can see.
They go in with the questions, I think.
Okay, we're going to do a kind of X Factor style audition where people are going to come to the front and talk to you directly.
Hi, Maureen Quigley, lecturer at the University of Manchester. So I'm rationally persuaded by what you say and what you said in your books and papers and by what Professor Temkin said earlier. But my problem is with moral motivation. And it's the same sort of problem I have every week when I tell myself I'll go to the gym later in the day or the next day, or I'll eat better. And so I have the same sort of motivational issues when it comes to changing my spending. Have you got any maybe more practical suggestions for the moral psychology aspect?
Well, the psychology aspect is very interesting. I'm glad you raised it. I didn't really have time to discuss it in what I said. But it's one of the reasons why giving what we can and the life you can save is talking about making a pledge. That's a little bit like, you know, the way to get people to go to the gym more often is to get them to pay up front, and then you think to yourself, oh, I've paid for 6 months at the gym. It's, you know, if I only go once every 2 weeks, that's going to cost me £20 every time I go. But if I go every day, that'll only cost me, you know, whatever, much less. So you make kind of a commitment. Now, we can't get you to do exactly that, but by making a pledge and being public about it, not just, you know, going online, making a pledge and leaving it at that, not telling anyone. I think it does create a sense that you're letting, not only you're letting yourself down if you don't follow through with that pledge, but you're not really honest to others, because you've done this, you talk about it in the group that you are there now, and you talk about it with your friends, you spread the idea. I think it's really important that we discuss this publicly, because there's lots of research that shows that people are more inclined to help somebody else if they see others are helping. And if they think that others are not helping, then they're less likely to do it. So not only do you make it psychologically easier for yourself to give, if you've talked about it and in some way therefore you'll feel ashamed of yourself if you don't do it, but you contribute to others giving as well, which may have just as big or more effect as your own donations do.
Okay. Any more questions? Yeah, one at the back.
Shall I come on, or shall I just stay here?
It's up to you.
I'll just stay here. So there's been, the focus of today seems to be what we can do and what those we know personally can do, friends and family giving 1% or 10%. The case of Professor Temkin may be spending less money on cigarettes and alcohol. But what would you advocate globally? If you could have your way, what would you do? Would everyone give 10%? Would the role of the government change? What is the best case scenario for you when it comes to this problem?
I'm sorry, I didn't get all of the sound. Simon, maybe if you could repeat. I sort of broke up a little bit.
So the question was about individual. Yeah, do you want to come and say it yourself? Actually, that's probably better.
Shall I just start again, or?
Repeat yourself.
Okay, I'll just say it all again. There's been a focus today on what we can do and what those we know can do to solve this problem, whether it's giving 1% or 10%. On the case of Professor Temkin spending less money on cigarettes and alcohol. But if you were to have your way, how would the world as a whole and everyone address this problem? Will we all just give 10% of our income? Would the role of the government change? Is there something else? Because I know it's probably most important to focus on what we can do right now. But ideally, and in the long term, what do you think we should do to address this problem?
So you're asking what if not just what we should do, but if everybody were to do this, whether that would solve the problem or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if everybody were to do this, we certainly wouldn't need to give 10%. I think that would be actually far too much and probably would have a negative impact on our own economies. I think it's important to realise that the amount required to get people out of extreme poverty, because that's really what I'm focusing on. I'm not talking about everybody being equal, which I think is really too utopian for the moment to discuss. It's relatively small because of that difference in the income that we have, right? Because of the fact that these people are living on, £1 or £1.50 a day, so let's say £500 a year. Whereas, of course, the average income in the UK, I don't know what it is, but it's it's 25 or 30,000 pounds, something like that, perhaps. So it's so much more that a relatively small contribution wouldn't have to be 10%, because we have roughly equal numbers too. We have roughly 1 billion people living in affluence in the developed world, and roughly 1 billion in extreme poverty, and there are other 5 billion somewhere in between. So it wouldn't require that big a transfer if we were really serious about making sure that this was done effectively as possible. So I think we could have quite modest amounts if we were to give, I think if it were 2%, say, by the million affluent people, that really would be sufficient. And I mean, there are many different things you could talk about how you should best do that. But some of the things that we do within a developed country seem to me to be sensible things we should do. So we provide safe drinking water to everyone. We provide sanitation to everyone. We provide a basic level of education to everyone. We provide a basic level of healthcare to everyone. And we provide a minimum economic security. Now these would be minimal, right? These would not be the level of healthcare that the NHS provides. This would not be the level of education that you have in Britain, which takes you all the way through high school onwards. But it would be some minimally basic healthcare, which is extremely cost effective because so many people die from diseases that are not complicated, diseases that we know how to cure, like pneumonia or diarrhea or malaria. Malaria we prevent better than we know how to cure, I guess. And it would be basic education, primary school education, and enough economic security. Not so much that it destroyed incentives for people to work, but enough so that people were not starving. I think I could see a world in which we extended that minimal kind of security net to everyone, and also gave them greater opportunities to become independent. So those would be the basic things, I think. And again, as I say, this is not going to solve every problem. There's still going to be wars. This is not going to stop that, and so there will still be situations that need more specific help. But I think it would reduce greatly the amount of poverty in the world.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay.
Can I introduce myself to them?
Sure.
Yeah, I think I do hear better when people are sitting up in front. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Professor. It's Alan Fenwick from SCI, and it's a great pleasure to have heard you for the first time, almost face to face.
Oh, that's bad.
My question relates to something that happened a couple of years ago when I was approached by a fundraiser who was claimed to be a professional, and he wanted to raise funds for neglected tropical diseases. I'm very proud of the vast numbers of small donations we get, but he laughed at it. He said, I'm going to raise £100 million, and the only way I'll do it is to get 100 people to give £1 million each. You're collecting small amounts, which are admittedly doing a lot of good. But the truth is he failed. And I wondered what your view was on the amount of effort that perhaps those people who want large donations should spend on trying to encourage those people who, let's face it, earn obscene amounts of money, the people in the NFL and the basketball league, the footballers here and the celebrities. And it seems to me that the people who have more and more money are less and less inclined to give in many ways.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I am a bit involved with people giving at the other level as well. So I've talked about the pledge for the life you can save. We've talked about the pledge for giving what we can. One pledge that we haven't talked about is the billionaires pledge. There is such a thing. It was started by Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, and it's part of their general work. slightly different from that. But the Billionaires Pledge is only for people who have $1 billion or more, and it asks them to pledge to give away half of their wealth during their lifetimes. Unfortunately, from my perspective, it doesn't say to give half their wealth to relieving global poverty. Gates and Buffett themselves do that. That's what they're putting their money into. But they felt that they would not get enough people to do that. So it simply talks about giving it to charity. And some of these people are going to give it to art museums to buy more Duccios or whatever, which seems to me to be not the best use of the money. But there are, on the current list, I think there are over 90 billionaires who have pledged to give half their money to charity. And that's a lot of money, right? I mean, you're really talking about very serious money with that. And if 10% of it goes to the global poor, and I hope the figure is more, that's a very significant amount. So people are trying to encourage this to happen. I also am working with a woman in the US who is encouraging university presidents, the equivalent of vice chancellors in your system, to pledge to give, I can't remember actually what the figure is, I think it's 5% that she's pledging, asking people to pledge, to set an example basically to their students. And there are some, it's not as many as I would have hoped. I think there are maybe around 30 university presidents who've pledged that. So there are efforts to work among other people. You mentioned like sports stars and so on, and entertainment stars also earn a lot. Some of them do give, and some of them act as ambassadors for organisations like Oxfam, and that's great. But yes, it would be very good to see more people doing that. And I know there are some people working on that, and I think that's also a worthwhile thing to do. Yeah.
Okay. I think we've got time for another quick one.
I've just been wondering, a lot of the focus of both presentations has been on money. But I know in various articles that you've written yourself that there are other ways that you can make a difference to global poverty, such as by whether or not you support certain economic activities, certain corporations, buy certain things, act a certain way in your life. Do you think that the argument that you have put across in the argument of the previous presentation suggests that we should alter these activities as well?
I think I heard you, the sound sort of broke up in a couple of points, but I certainly do think that it's worthwhile to try to change some of the ways in which the world economy is ordered, if that's the kind of thing that you're asking about. One of my colleagues, Thomas Pogge at Yale University, has written more directly about this. But there are certainly things in the global economic order that are, to put it mildly, not helpful in terms of reducing global poverty. And I think it is good to work to try to change those things. It's very difficult to get change because now we're talking about such a huge, cumbersome thing, like the conditions under which the World Trade Organization works, or the way in which we take minerals and oil resources from developing countries. I do think that it's worthwhile trying to work to change some of those things. But I think that's only for some people. It's only for people who are really prepared to be active and dedicated to that and put time and effort into that. And without necessarily seeing any results. I mean, the first question was about the psychological issues about giving, but there are also psychological issues about activism. How hard do you work on it? You don't really see yourself as making great progress. And I know a lot of people do this for a while and then burn out and get disillusioned. So it's psychologically difficult for some people to keep doing that, but for those who do, yes, I think that's certainly a valuable activity. So I hope that answered your question. As I say, I wasn't quite sure that I caught all of it.
It was more just about like individual people's activities, such as buying Coca-Cola, buying people that exploit certain people in other worlds, and certain activities that we have that you mentioned in other ones of your books, like Practical Ethics, etc.
So you're asking about ethical consumerism, really?
Yeah, certain things that we can do to alter poverty in the world by our activities.
Yeah, certainly. Look, I'm a strong supporter of fair trade. I think the Fair Trade Organisation is a way of making sure that the producers of commodities in developing countries get a fair return for their labour. So I definitely think it's worth buying fair trade products, even if sometimes they cost a little bit more. It is another way of effectively helping people and also, of course, encouraging them to produce and to become more independent. I think, I have views about ethical consumerism that go well beyond this. As some of you may know about the ethical status of animals, for example, which suggests that you ought not to be eating meat because of concerns for animals, but also I think that's important for reducing climate change and reducing food waste, especially where you're talking about factory farmed animals. So I think there's a lot of issues about the ethics of what we eat in particular, and I've actually got a book on that topic, came out a few years ago. I think in the UK it's called Eating, in here it's called The Ethics of What We Eat, but it does talk about those issues as well. We're going to have to stop, unfortunately. If there's one more question I could take, if somebody is keen to ask one more question, but I do have another commitment pretty soon.